Welcome. Do press like and subscribe. Some good news. The far-right demagogue Bolsonaro, who's ruled Brazil for the last few years, has been defeated in the country's presidential elections. Lula, the former president, the progressive standard bearer, has won. Latin America now mostly run by progressive governments. Now, we're going to talk about this. The good part, very important. We need optimism. We're going to talk about some nuances as well. It's very important people to understand this isn't all good news. Sorry to maybe on the parade, etc., etc. In that spirit, we've got two brilliant guests to explain everything and educate me as well as you. David Adler, who is the international coordinator, have I got that right, of the Progressive International, and Aline Piva, who is the Latin America coordinator of Progressive International in Sao Paulo. Is that right? Sao Paulo.
Yes.
Yes. Facts. Very important in a discussion like this. Okay. How was Lula? Let's start with the good bit. I like to start with optimism. How was Lula able to defeat this far-right monstrosity, Bolsonaro? Who wants to start?
I'll kick it off. David. I think that Lula's victory has push and pull factors. Some of the push factors will be familiar to many of your viewers, listeners, and peoples around the world, because there are few governments, to be honest, that have survived this period of pandemic, economic crisis, and inflation. Bolsonaro's government was a disaster. Some would say a genocidal disaster for his absolute and horrendous mismanagement of the pandemic, leading to hundreds of thousands of excess deaths here in Brazil, and becoming a sort of not just a laughingstock for the world, but a huge menace for overseeing large-scale deforestation, invasion, theft of indigenous and ancestral lands in the Amazon. That on top of the crisis of hunger and food insecurity coming back to Brazil, and you really saw a kind of class warfare that Brazil never saw under the PT, founded as it was by a kind of class compromise around redistribution and taking care of the poor, building institutions like education. So one of the main attack lines from the Lula campaign was, how many universities did you build, Bolsonaro? And the answer is, like none, compared to the kind of infrastructure institutions that were built with the PT. So there were a lot of push factors, a lot of rage and resentment about the kind of authoritarian, some would say outrightly fascist government that Bolsonaro was leading and intending to hold on for as long as he could, for as long as the institutions would allow him. In terms of pull factors, though, the Lula really rode a wave of support, some would say oftentimes nostalgia, about the governments that he led in his first and second mandates. These were about building those institutions like education, health, and industry that saw Brazil become a major world power, that saw people go from living in slums to sending their kids to university with having a decent job and clean water. These are remarkable achievements, and so that kind of transformation of Brazil that PT has led was a huge pull factor for a lot of people, in particular poor people, working class people who've turned out in droves to vote for Lula. We'll get into this later, Owen, but this was a hugely class polarized election, hugely geography polarized election. We saw a kind of typical, middle class millennial male figure, Bolsonarista figure, who's been super radicalized to the right. But we were fortunate enough to see the really vast mobilization of poor Brazilians clinging on to that dream of a Brazil that takes care of its poor, that addresses that food insecurity and the crisis of hunger, that builds housing and provides healthcare to its people. And that was the vision that carried the day yesterday in what was the closest election in Brazil's modern history.
Yeah, Aline, I mean, Bolsonaro, for a lot of people watching this or listening to this, they know bad person, bad president. Can you just spell out, though, just kind of briefly, how egregious, how terrible, how bad was Bolsonaro in practice?
Well, we are talking about a president that when we reached a point here in the pandemic in Brazil where over 3,000 people were dying daily, and he just went on a live stream and pretending he was dying he couldn't breathe. It was just extremely, I think this was very telling of how inhumane this person is. And there are egregious factors, like personal facts. For example, he said out loud that he wanted to have a relationship, a sexual relationship with a child, a 14-year-old girl, and no one called this what it is. It was a pedophile act. But more than that, he used the state to commit outright acts of corruption. In the coming months before the election, he just instrumentalized the finances of the state to buy votes. He created these programs to do handouts of cash to poor people in the country as a way to try to convince them to vote for Bolsonaro. And it worked at some level, because when we see the votes, he still pulled it quite well despite of all the damage he has done to the country. There are several corruption scandals. One that is called Rachadinha. It's being called, and this one, Rachadinha, and the secret budget, orçamento secreto. It has just recently been called by International Amnesty and other international organizations as the largest corruption scandal in history of Latin America. But they spin it really well. And even though Mensalão and other attacks to the Workers' Party were based on corruption, Bolsonaro has done a very, I would say, interesting as a word to keep the conversation going, a very interesting job in spin that narrative. So it's not corruption. We are protecting ourselves. We are protecting our government and so on. So it's really interesting to see how corruption went from being a tool for a coup, as we saw with Dilma Rousseff. It wasn't corruption on her, but it was part of the narrative against the Workers' Party, to being something that gather support behind a very corrupted, a terrible government.
David, just quickly, voter suppression. We heard very disturbing reports yesterday about basically organs of the state engaged in intimidation, suppression. Just to explain quickly what happened.
The Brazilian right are some of the most creative coup plotters and false flag operation planners. They love this stuff. I mean, this is the stuff that they thrive on. And there are so many things that happen in this campaign that it's like hard to recap. Obviously, my brain is a bit of scrambled eggs. But just to give a few examples, I'll give 3 examples. Example number 1, extremely important, and almost no one in the international media was talking about it. The candidate for Sao Paulo governor, who is now the elected governor of Sao Paulo, which is basically the second most powerful position in the entire country of Brazil, on the campaign tried to look like a tough guy and walk into a favela in the state. And the people in the favela were like, get out of here. Get out of here with your press team and your security team. His security detail pulls a gun and kills this guy, kills an unarmed guy for telling his team to leave. They then try to spin this as if it were an assassination attempt, like he's a hero who walked in, tough on crime, campaigning in a favela, survived an assassination attempt, right? Because that was one of the things that worked so well for Bolsonaro, was spinning the attack on Bolsonaro in 2018 as being a kind of martyr for the cause, right? And then there were journalists there who were recording the whole thing, and they forced these guys to delete all the footage. And luckily, the journalist was recording the audio the whole time that was then leaked, right? This is a huge scandal, and he still didn't lose. He still won 55% of votes, and he will be the candidate. He will be the governor of Sao Paulo, a guy who's not even from Sao Paulo, who doesn't know anything about Sao Paulo, the guy who campaigned on taking body cams off of police. That's example number 1, Owen. Example number 2, one day before the election, while Aline and I, with our delegation, included Zara Sultan and Jeremy Corman, are walking along the streets next to the large-scale mobilization for Lula, 1 block away, a Bolsonarista MP, federal deputy, pulls a gun on a young black Lula supporter and chases him through the street with a gun pulled on him, and then tries to spin that as if the PT sent a black man to come intimidate and harass her. Luckily, again, people were on the street taking video to debunk all of these claims. And then the third, most outrageous, and again, will not be, I think we cannot expect accountability for these things because there are so many examples, such flagrant violations of the law. Aline gave some great examples of the largest scale corruption scandal in the history of Brazil conducted under this Bolsonaro government. Was what happened yesterday. Yesterday was, I don't hesitate to say, a straight up coup attempt by the Bolsonarista right. The head of the highway police forces signed an order at 2:43 in the morning saying, whatever happens, don't listen to the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, whatever they tell us, and sent out his people to conduct 560 highway blockades in heavily Lula voting areas, the same areas that delivered this election for Lula, in fact, in the Northeast, to try to slow down, subdue voter turnout, and intimidate people to stay home with, traffic and fear of being stopped. They were stopping people just for having Lula stickers on their car. Now, that is a violation of the law in Brazilian law. Impeding the population from voting is an electoral violation, right? But then yesterday at the press conference, G. Moraes, the head of the Brazil Electoral Court, comes out and goes, "Nah, I mean, this is fine. No one was really impeded from voting. This wasn't illegal. We're gonna let it slide." And so this is, I dare to say, like a tactic of the coup mongering right is to flood you with so many scandals, flood you with so many flagrant and shameless violations of law and norm that it's just sort of like, okay, well, what are we going to do? We can't go after all these people.
Aline, notwithstanding this horrific attempt at intimidation and a coup attempt, as David puts it there, if I was to grow, in a bottle, a caricature, monstrous right-winger, it would be Bolsonaro. A disastrous record. Huge numbers of people unnecessarily died of COVID because of his mismanagement. But nearly half of Brazil still voted for this guy, up against the most popular president in Brazil's history. Pretty disturbing. Why did so many people, even after all this, vote for Bolsonaro? Who are they? Who's that voter coalition? And what does that tell us?
I think there are a couple of reasons there. And I will start with a historical one. When you look at the votes, like the map of the votes, the states who voted for Lula and the states who voted for Bolsonaro, you see there's a pretty clear divide in the country. It is the north and the northeast against the south and the southeast. Southeast developed, southeast with more industrialized, more access to public services and so on, and the north of the country, who was historically forgotten by the state for centuries. The PT governments were the first governments in our recent history who looked at those states and said, we have potential here, we have to develop here, we have to address issues such as drought, lack of education, lack of industrialization, and so on. And this is something that is still holds. The south of the country was largely benefited by Bolsonaro's handout of privilege to some businessmen. Agribusiness also played a role on having those voters still support Bolsonaro. The second reason I would say is this whole process of buying votes. The electoral system here in Brazil is really good. We don't contest the legitimacy, but we understand that who votes are humans, and humans can be bought. And Bolsonaro used the state, all the machinery of the state, to buy those votes. For example, in one of the meetings that we attended, our host announced that one thing that Bolsonaro was doing is paying mayors so they can have votes in exchange. For example, I will send you X amount of money to your little city in the countryside, but you have to guarantee that I will have 500 voters in your constituency. And this generated kind of a snowball effect throughout the country. And The last reason I would say is that the anti-Workers' Party, the anti-Lula sentiment is still strong.
Yeah.
This is a sentiment that was fostered through many, many years of attacks on the media, of lawfare, of fake news, and it's still strong, and it's a challenge that has not been, let's say, properly addressed so far.
David, do you want to add just anything quickly about that closeness and what it tells us?
I just think it's tempting to read it through a sort of both sides or symmetrical lens. But I think what Aline's pointing out is just the asymmetry in between left and right and how we build our projects and how we undo them. It's really hard in a country of this scale, of this scope and diversity, to build a left project. I mean, how do we build projects on the left? We build them through vision, through program, through love and care. We build them through a promise to deliver. And how does the right do it? Through lies, deception, delusion, and basically the destruction of your expectations. And so, Bolsonaro entered Brazil in the vicious cycle of reducing the state, destroying institutions of the state, therefore reducing your expectations about the state, therefore reducing your desire to see a government that wants to mobilize the resources and infrastructure of the state to do well by you. And that's this is like a classic Tory party, UK Tories tactic, just undermine the state, use austerity to undermine the state. And then when a politician comes along, like a Jeremy Corbyn, to say, you know what, we're going to rebuild the state and we're going to make those institutions work for you. People go, what are you talking about? For the past 10 years, I can't get access to food, education, or go to the NHS. How are you going to do this? How are you going to make rail work? How are you going to make, the water or these energy companies that you've privatized work? So, this is just it's easy to fuel that, to fuel an anti-Pachista or anti-PT sentiment. And it's much harder after 6 years of coup government, right? Starting in 2014, starting in 2016, all the way to yesterday, 6 years of just wearing down the state, undermining that hope that people could have, that their government could represent them, their priorities and their needs. So I think that we arrive at this figure that looks like, wow, Lula offered this and Bolsonaro offered this, and people split half down the line. I think more worrying, looking at this stuff and looking at those asymmetrical tactics, is what Aline was describing there between the regional, geographic, class, and gender polarization. It's one thing to go half on an electorate, but it's kind of mapped evenly over the country, and evenly over generations, and evenly over genders. The fact is that Brazil is now more divided than ever. I think it's possible to say, it's more divided by class. It's scary to see, people think that millennials are going to carry the flag of a new progressive politics. Not here in Brazil. Young millennial men are the primary Bolsonarista demographic, and they're coming into Congress and they're coming into politics and high profile social media to a really strong extent. And so that is the challenge that the PT is going to have, is how to, and this is a challenge that we all the progressive governments that are coming to power in the context of increasing polarization are having, how to reunite a country on the basis of a program and a kind of class compromise that it implies, that, okay, you're going to do well, but we're going to redistribute some of those resources, some of those rents that you've been hoarding this time. We're going to make those work for the poor, and we're going to increase the productivity of this country. We're going to make Brazil a country that is not just importing fertilizer and exporting soy, but is actually providing good jobs in industry and leading a green transition that actually puts workers first, whatever it is, right? We're going to do all that, and you're going to gain, but you're not going to gain at the expense of the poor. And so that's the kind of challenge is, Bolsonaro's economy is a zero-sum economy where the rich gain at the poor's expense. And Lula wants to make a positive-sum economy where we grow and the poor do better because it's a poor-first program. We're called the Workers' Party for a reason, right? and it's becoming increasingly difficult to tap into that sense of positive sum economics in a country that's lived through such violence and such destruction of its state machinery.
So just finally, two things put together. Brazil's future. What is Lula's program, and will he be able to? How much will he be able to implement? So we're talking, I suppose, social and environmental justice, and in terms of Bolsonaroism and Bolsonaro himself, where does that fit into Brazil's future? Because it's clearly not going to go away, especially if it's got in Brazil a substantial support amongst younger Brazilians, which is quite unlike what's happening, for example, in Britain or Spain or whatever. So, Aline, just Brazil's future. What's the program? Will he be able to implement it? And what about Bolsonaroism?
I will start with the last one. This is something that was very clear to everyone here and everyone who was involved in the process. Defeat Bolsonaro does not mean defeat Bolsonarismo. Bolsonarismo is something that, as David said, is entrenched in society, has conquered over the hearts and minds of many young Brazilians. But I think this win yesterday was very symbolic of, even though this is very entrenched, even though it has powerful enemies, the popular mobilization, the campaign here this year was something that I had never seen before. You know, people organized themselves in popular committees. They went to the streets, they talked to people, they energized themselves. So I think this is very positive. It's something that is not going to stop with the elections. At some level, we understood that if we don't go back to go door to door, talk to people, create that space for political education, to fight back fake news, Bolsonarismo will never go away. This is an important lesson, and I think it has been learned and will continue to be implemented by the people. It's not a part organized. It was something that Brazilians created and are carrying on. Yesterday on Lula's it's not an inaugural speech because he will take power only on January 1st, 2023. But on his speech yesterday, he said that his priority is going to be, one, fight hunger and misery. Today we have over 30 million people who go hungry every day at some level here in Brazil. Of those, 10 million are children. This is his number one priority. He did it before and he wanted to do it again. Second, he promised to end the Amazon, the deforestation in the Amazon. This is a very important goal. And I think he's open to international cooperation in that, and this is going to be a very important step for us. And third, what he said, and this was extremely telling of the challenge that we are going to face, is that he will rebuild our democratic institutions, the democratic relations as the Constitution, as the Brazilian Constitution foresees. He will rebuild those relationships. That was an important sign for Bolsonarismo. Bolsonaro was able to manage to put out his allies, close allies, in almost every institution of the state. And Lula is willing to fight that back. That's going to be extremely important for us in the next period.
David.
Sorry. Long night. I think Aline covered well the domestic priorities of the new government. I would speak only to the international side, which I think is a really important aspect of this new government, very close to Lula's heart, and also very important to the project of the PT since Lula's first mandate, which is turning Brazil into a kind of force for South-South solidarity and the construction of a new architecture for South-South cooperation and a new role for the global South, broadly speaking, and Latin America in particular, in this incoming multipolar world, international order, call it what you want. So there's two lines I think that are most important there that you can read in Lula's inauguration speech or any of the campaign discourse in the run-up to yesterday's election. One key piece, one key plank is Latin American integration. Brazil is a country with 220 million people. Is that right, Aline?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a huge country. So, a lot of people talk about wanting to build these institutions between países hermanos, between, fraternal countries in Latin America, but Brazil can do it because Brazil has the economic weight. It has the institutions, it has the ability to lead these processes. So Owen, at the outset of the program, you mentioned that we've seen progressive governments coming to power in places like Chile, in places like Colombia, Bolivia, of course, still holding on in Argentina. And many of those countries have been in kind of a holding pattern while Lula prepares to come to government. And the hope is that Lula can switch on those processes and accelerate them. CELAC, which is the organization of Latin American and Caribbean states, and the potential for reconstruction of UNASUR, which is the Union of South American Nations. This is to facilitate greater trade, health integration, stuff that would allow Latin America to become a more resilient, more integrated, more solidaristic zone, as opposed to that kind of more colonial and extractive economy that sort of import from elsewhere, export to elsewhere, and not have the kind of resilience that would allow it to build its own vaccines and not have to rely on U.S. International intellectual property protected, patent protected vaccines and medicine, for example. So Latin American integration, a very important project for Lula. Yesterday, Aline and I were, I think I was probably the only U.S. American in that room. Everyone there from Latin America just so excited to have Lula back to lead some of those processes. Now, the more controversial aspect of Lula's new government will be his vision for the world at large. This is about reconstructing the BRICS coalition. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, expanding that coalition to include countries like Argentina. It's about Brazil reclaiming its role as the main port of call for African nations to be a partner in development on the African continent. So, Lula really wants there to be, a new pole in this incoming international order that is here in Latin America, but that is an engine for development and cooperation around the world. And so that's going to be a very interesting point of tension. Yesterday, very clearly, it was fascinating to listen in the, few minutes that he shared with us as the international guests. He was clear to emphasize, we will not support a new Cold War between the U.S. and China. We will have relations with everyone, was the direct quote from Lula last night in our meeting. And I think that resistance to a new Cold War means basically insisting on having a sovereign foreign policy that does not necessarily align with the foreign policy priorities of the United States, of Europe and Britain, nor will it overlap with what we're now calling the Western left. I mean, I think it's going to take its own course set by its own diplomats, its own foreign ministry, and that will be a really important test of Brazil's relationship with my country of origin, with the United Kingdom, and of course with progressive forces around the world as a new international order comes into shape.
Great stuff, both of you. Very comprehensive there. Obviously, a great victory for this little fella. But celebration, not triumphalism. I think that is the message coming out. But nonetheless, something to celebrate, something to build on, even if there remains big question marks over the progressive future for Brazil and the rest of humanity. Thank you both so much to David and Aline. If you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, press like. If you're listening on the podcast, thanks. Really appreciate it. I will see you all soon. Thanks, you both.